Out of all the metro areas in the US, it's probably the coldest, and it also has just about the highest bicycling mode share out of all of them. All about Minneapolis and St. Paul, a metro area that defies a lot of conventional wisdom about cities, coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation, and I think I can now say this will be a recurring series where I visit a city, film it, and tell you what I'm seeing from the perspective of someone with the better part of a couple decades in the urban planning business and maybe a bit of an attitude problem. Quick evergreen disclaimer, when I do these city visits, I have like 3 days, so I'm not going to be able to see everything I want to see in a comprehensive way, especially when I have other stuff on the agenda, which I did on this trip. So this isn't going to be an exhaustive inventory of every single interesting thing in the Twin Cities. I mean, I barely got to St. Paul, so another trip is probably in order. But as usual, I did reach out on social media to get suggestions on where to go in the Twin Cities and what to film, and boy, did I get suggestions. But a lot of them were things like ride the light rail system and go check out all the new transit-oriented development. Like, I'm gonna spend 3 days walking around taking pictures of 5/1s and dense infill. Well, I hate to break it to you Minneapolitans, but every city has stuff like that. If I'm only in a city for 3 or 4 days, I want to see things that I can't see anywhere else, or things that are done better here, or worse, than they're done anywhere else. So you can tell me to go to cool walkable neighborhoods that have good streetcar era urban fabric like Como or Whittier, which they're trying to rebrand as Eat Street, and where they're still calling crashes accidents, I guess. Or Lynn Lake, which is looking good except for these eyesore rectangular rapid flashing beacons. Let me know if you want a video on these. I have thoughts. Or Dinkytown, which is super walkable, but being super walkable apparently doesn't absolve you from needing street space for the storage of military-grade vehicles. Or you can tell me to talk about freeways, and the downtowns of both cities are encircled by freeway moats. But I'm not really going to spend time on it because I hate to break it to you, but this is pretty common across the US. And anyway, follow the Segregation By Design account if you want your fix of freeway injustice rage. Because I'm just going to level with you on how all this actually works. The quote-unquote filming I do is me walking around pointing my phone at stuff, and I'm just not going to spend 1 second walking around some godforsaken freeway interchange photographing like guardrails and slip lanes. Although, if someone has the audacity to put one of these romantic padlocks on a freeway overpass cyclone fence, I'll probably document that. Instead, I just wanted to focus on the things about the Twin Cities that just make it different from other US metro areas. Like, I feel like the region has above average cultural amenities, great theater scene for a city its size, probably produced a disproportionate number of iconic musicians. And related, I think, you might be shocked by the amount of cultural diversity. Yeah, it's not all Norwegians walking around saying "you betcha." There are very large concentrations of Hmong and Somali refugees who I think were attracted to the area because it's been regarded as relatively welcoming with good job opportunities. So you get things like transit ticket validators that speak languages you don't see in most cities. And how many other cities' ballparks have Hmong food stands? Here's another thing that jumped out at me, particularly about Minneapolis. Just the sheer amount of defunct rail infrastructure that's been turned into something else. The Amtrak station got torn down in the late 70s, and Amtrak just goes to St. Paul now. The Milwaukee Railroad Depot is now a hotel or multiple hotels. There are rail trails, which I will come back to. There are rails that are just decorative at this point. There are rail bridges that are just bike and ped bridges now. And we have to talk about the Stone Arch Bridge. This was a structure over the Mississippi built for the Great Northern Railway back in the 1880s, and like a lot of rail right-of-way in the city, it's been converted to bicycle and pedestrian use. It does feel a bit sad that there aren't trains anymore, but instead you get a picturesque bridge that runs between the Marcy Homes neighborhood on the east side and the Mill District on the west side, which is also full of well-preserved structures that don't serve the same functions they once did. While we're on multimodal bridges, let's check out the Washington Avenue, which connects downtown Minneapolis to the University of Minnesota. I've talked about this bridge a few times because it's so notable among American multimodal bridges, but this is very Minneapolis. On the top deck, you can bike on the north side, and if you're walking, you can walk along the south side to get views. Or if it's cold, you can walk inside the climate-controlled enclosure. On the bottom deck, there are trains, buses, and some general traffic. You know, I wanted a cool shot of Green Line trains coming on and off the bridge, so I waited at the east portal for like 10 minutes and nothing happened. I'll come back to the light rail later. As far as the university itself, it's a pretty great urban campus, and as I walked around, I couldn't quite remember why it only ranked number 10 on my university's list. Close in location with light rail running right through campus. And even though it's summer term, the bike usage was still evident, both on campus and around the neighborhoods nearby. Lots of grandiose architecture and a football practice facility. I've watched a lot of college football in my lifetime, and it comes as kind of a shock to me that the Golden Gophers actually practice. Let's touch on biking a bit more because the Twin Cities does have one of the highest bike mode shares of any region in the US. First of all, the public bike share system, Nice Ride, was like $8 a month apparently, but they ripped it all out earlier this year, and now there are dockless Lime bikes that cost $1 to unlock, and then they're like 39 cents a minute, which is really unfortunate if you don't have your own bike handy because the city is clearly doing a lot to build out the downtown cycling network. I assume the raised paths are now a street frontage requirement for redevelopment, which makes sense when your streets are this wide. I'll come back to that. And while we're downtown, let's talk transit. No, I don't mean Norse maritime conveyances. Let's start with the light rail. I did have a lot of viewers suggest that I ride it, which of course I did. But it is another one of these things that just looks a lot like what you have in other US cities. Several people actually cautioned me that the trains are unpleasant or don't get off at Lake Street because it's super sketchy. I definitely got off at Lake Street, and I'll talk about that later in the video. But I do feel like, as a society, we kind of don't do a great job differentiating between being made to feel a bit uncomfortable from actually being exposed to a safety risk. If your main problem with transit is that it isn't used exclusively by gainfully employed people who look and smell the way you want them to, I'd just suggest that's a problem well outside the scope of transit. Anyway, the operational shortcomings of Metro Light Rail were evident even as I was waiting to catch my first Blue Line at the airport. 15-minute headways, not terrible, but not really worthy of a city this size. Honestly, Metro seems to be doing more with bus rapid transit now. There's the Orange Line, which is a freeway median running BRT, not my favorite transit alignment for catalyzing station area development or fostering a pleasant waiting environment. I can't imagine what they spent on this Lake Street station. But Metro keeps rolling out new non-freeway running lines, and while they aren't like gold standard center running BRT with 100% dedicated lanes, they're pretty good and they seem to have better frequency than the trains. So one thing I did was take the D-Line BRT down to 38th and Chicago. Or actually, it was originally supposed to stop at 38th and Chicago, but the route diverts around that intersection because the location is now a fairly elaborate memorial, not only to George Floyd, who was killed there in 2020, but to numerous other Black people who have been killed by people who are sworn to protect. I didn't take pictures at 38th and Chicago because it seems crass, but being an epicenter of protest is also a really important part of the Twin Cities identity, and it does permeate your sense of the city as you walk around. At least it did for me. There's way more to say about this than I'm gonna get into here. I could probably do like 5 different videos on the Twin Cities, honestly. Okay, it is Minnesota, and I've sort of been burying the lead here. Last year, people asked me, how do you function in like 114-degree temperatures in Vegas? Well, the answer is, I wear sunscreen, I drink water, and I take a shower when I get home. But sub-zero temperatures and sheer walls of snow, that requires a different breed of human, and that human exists in Minnesota. So before we leave transit, let's recognize that a lot of the transit stations and shelters in the Twin Cities are heated. This is not something you see in most US cities. The real star of the Twin Cities climate-controlled show, though, is the downtown skyway system, and honestly, I still haven't made up my mind about it, and it probably requires its own video anyway. It's like an entire self-contained universe, one floor up, and I couldn't decide, is it a necessary convenience due to the winter weather, or is it a kind of dystopian 70s, 80s idea of how cities should be designed, where you park in a downtown garage and just walk from place to place in a hermetically sealed environment? I was amazed at the number of businesses that are actually open on the second level in downtown Minneapolis, and how busy some of them are at lunch hour on a weekday in 2023. There's just so much leasable commercial storefront type space here, probably more than on the second floor of any other US city downtown. And I couldn't deny the convenience of it. I did walk from my hotel down near the football stadium all the way to Target Field, where the Twins play, just using the Skyway system exclusively. Temperatures outside were in the 90s, like a sticky Midwest 90s. So the infrastructure isn't just for the winter, but there's no doubt the Skyways cannibalize pedestrian activity from the streets, especially with the stadiums. They just have Skyways connecting to the parking garages. So people who come downtown from the suburbs just often don't experience any street life at all. And maybe that's the way some people like it, but those are probably not people who actually live in the city. But I get it. If you're gonna have a Skyway system, you kind of have to go all in. You can't have like sandwich shops and convenience stores lease space and then only get pedestrian traffic a few months of the year when the city turns into Siberia. So it's hard to blame the city for letting this kind of aesthetic hang around. But the consequence, it has to be said, is that you have large swaths of the downtown grid that are just very quiet. Even the Nicollet Mall, which is designed to be pedestrian and transit friendly, feels like a bit of a wasteland, which, keep in mind, was not at all the case in TV sitcom depictions of downtown Minneapolis in the 1970s. Now, some of this lack of vibrancy is pandemic related, but I want to dig into this a little bit because there's weird evidence of dysfunction all over downtown, like this watch for pedestrians active signage. I guess I don't hate it, but the fact that you need anything like this on a downtown street is a little troubling. The real tell, though, is these posts with the pedestrian call buttons, which are all over downtown, and a lot of them are newly installed. If there's an indicator species that tells you your downtown is not what it should be, well, this might be it. I'm gonna talk about this more in a future video, but pedestrian countdown timers are based on how long the crossing distances are. So if the streets are wide, the walk phases are gonna be long, sometimes longer than the traffic engineers want to set as a default. So they put in big buttons, so longer pedestrian phases only get activated when they're needed. Well, two things here. If your downtown streets are wide enough that crossing the street takes so much time that there's even a question of whether you need a call button, your streets are too wide. Second, I understand the design of these little posts is probably ADA driven, but the last thing you need on your downtown corners, which you should be planning for the most pedestrian congestion, is more obstructions cluttering the space. All of this stuff is connected. The width of the streets, the way the signals work, the fact that a lot of pedestrians seem to prefer to just travel around downtown one floor up. And I can see the city is trying to rectify some of it, but man, there's a lot of work to be done. Okay, so downtown's a bit of a mixed bag for me, but in a minute, I'm gonna get to my number one thing that I really think sets Minneapolis apart and makes it very cool. But first, quick reminder to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the on-the-ground, city-specific urbanist content, which I do intend to do more of. Follow and connect in the usual places, and the direct support is always appreciated. Let's get to a couple other things that are different here. The Metropolitan Council is one of only 2 multi-county regional governments in the US, the other being Portland. You know, while I was here, viewers in Portland would send me messages like, "How are you liking Portland Light?" Which is kind of dumb. I guess the idea is Minneapolis has light rail, it's just not as well developed as Portland's. Minneapolis has biking, just not as good as Portland. Very debatable, by the way, and I'll get to that. Minneapolis barricades their downtown police headquarters, but it's not quite the fortress environment you see in parts of downtown Portland. Well, you know what Portland doesn't have? An independent park and recreation board formed in 1883 with the passage of the Park Act establishing protection and maintenance of public green spaces throughout the city. You know, the Twin Cities did not show up on my top 10 urban parks video just because there isn't a single great park. There's a whole bunch of them, and most of them are connected by greenways. So again, contradiction, or maybe not. This is the metro area with some of the toughest weather in the country, but the weather is pleasant a lot of the year and people really take advantage of the park system. So here's a controversial opinion. Lakes are awesome and a lot of cities just don't have them. Now, if you live in, say, Seattle, Green Lake or Lake Union are cool. If you live in Oakland, Lake Merritt, very cool. Well, if you live in Minneapolis, there are like 10 Lake Merritts, and they're mostly connected together by the Grand Rounds Trail, and they just call the whole thing the Chain of Lakes. You occasionally have to do an at-grade crossing, but the busiest locations have all red scramble signals, so the whole thing is just completely first-rate in my opinion. And there's lots of boating, there's beaches and sunbathing, there's fishing, but mostly there are just lots of people out walking and biking. The key here is the park board made all of the lake frontage in the city publicly accessible, which you just don't see in a lot of municipal park systems. Try walking on the shore of like Lake Oswego and see how far you get before someone calls the cops. Anyway, the sense I get is the passage of the Park Act and all the good things that flow from that are because the lakes are such an important geographic feature and such an important part of the identity of not just the state of Minnesota, but also its biggest city. And that's not even to mention an actual falls within the city limits, easily accessible by light rail. Anyway, my theory here is that the accessibility of green space and the connecting path system creates knock-on effects for the overall trail network in Minneapolis and biking and walking infrastructure in general. I'm going to come back to this idea, but first, let's head east from where Bede-Makaska meets Lake of the Isles and go into the Uptown district. So look, lots of cities upzone around transit-rich areas, like right here on Lake Street, where you have a lot of bus service. And I'm not going to argue with that, but recognize you're putting in a lot of density along a 4-lane, one-way traffic sewer environment that isn't a pleasant place to walk or spend time. Some of these buildings seem fairly new, but they're boarded up at street level with blacked out windows. It just doesn't seem like an inviting place to lease a storefront. Let's go back to Chain of Lakes briefly and recognize that it does connect to the Midtown Greenway, another piece of defunct rail infrastructure that runs parallel to Lake Street, just a couple blocks north, all the way to the Mississippi River, so about 5 miles. And this is where you see something that I just don't see in other US cities: greenway-oriented development. The Midtown Greenway corridor has walkability, bikeability, greenery, and just an overall human friendliness that does not exist on Lake Street. It's 100% a transportation corridor, and if you're one of the many people in Minneapolis who bikes, this has to be just about an ideal living arrangement. But even if you don't, remember, you're just 2 blocks away from pretty decent bus transit, but it's much quieter and much more pleasant. Remember, there's a healthy amount of right-of-way on Lake Street, but nearly all of it is getting spent on motor vehicle movement and storage. And look, I get that having bikes on sidewalks is not optimal, but 5 or 6 lanes for cars and 0 for bikes and scooters, you're making it really hard for people to do the right thing. As you make your way west, Lake Street takes on a different flavor. Lots of Latino influence as you work your way into Midtown. And there's a massive repurposed Sears department store where you can find the Midtown Market, which doesn't have chain establishments, just grocery and food vendors that spring from the region's vibrant immigrant communities. So if you're into diversity, and you should be, Midtown's got it. But I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. There are problems. This shuttered Kmart, which completely breaks the street grid, by the way. Like, it completely blocks Nicollet Avenue, one of the city's great streets. It's just a mess. A lot of people milling around who just need a lot of help. As I was walking around here, a dude who I did not photograph came up to me and pointed out which abandoned looking car was actually an undercover cop car, so be careful what kind of business I was gonna try to transact. Pretty helpful, if I'm being honest. I know this is getting redeveloped. Twin Cities folks, let me know what the plan is. And then right across the street, there's this beautiful new north-south protected bike facility. And it's just sort of a microcosm of a core thing all cities are struggling with: economic disparities and how to improve the urban realm without creating more pressure on housing affordability. To be fair, that's a bigger issue than any single city can deal with by itself. I guess my closing thought here is people vote with their feet. They want to live and congregate and frequent businesses on streets that feel safe to walk and bike, and where you can actually hear the person next to you talking. And if the development action and human social activity are happening on narrower, more people-centered streets, that's probably an indication of the direction you want to go. If you're building weird podiums for beg buttons on the corners of your downtown, that's probably an indication you're going the wrong direction. At the risk of being overly reductive, your city is the infrastructure it chooses to build and maintain. Big investments, both good and bad, become a sunk cost that reverberates through everything your city decides to do decades, even centuries into the future. They become your civic identity, for better or worse, and you hope that a region like the Twin Cities leans into the things that actually make it great. Okay, so if you've watched this channel with any regularity at all, you know I love to street view cities. It's always been my go-to activity when I'm procrastinating, and I'm guessing I'm not alone in this. And one city I've definitely tried to street view is Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, because it's so odd, but I haven't had much success. Well, luckily, there's a video for that, and helpfully, it's called Prudhoe Bay, and it is another extremely well done Wendover production. It answers all my questions about why this place exists, and more importantly, how this place exists. And it has all kinds of cool, curated footage that helps you understand the place visually. Prudhoe Bay from Wendover's Extremities series is a Nebula original, and it's another great example of how Nebula supports creators in exploring different topics and approaches to making content. Nebula is a creator-owned platform, so when you sign up, you're really supporting a platform that, by its very nature, is designed to support creators in a long-term structural way, financially, professionally, and creatively. So if you want to support the long-term viability of what I'm doing, signing up for Nebula is a great way to do that, but mostly just sign up for the content. The Nebula subscription does now come with classes, and new ones are getting added all the time. The classes are from Nebula creators, but they aren't just about making videos. Like Simon Clark's Turn Data into Stories dives into a whole theory of storytelling and shows you how you can apply it to basically any situation where you want to share information in a compelling, persuasive way. So if you sign up for Nebula with the link down in the description, you get all the Nebula content, including classes, for $250 a month, which is 40% off the usual price. It really is a lot for what you're paying, and you will be supporting the channel in a way that makes a difference. And you'll be able to watch a version of this video that does not have a Nebula promo in it. Just something to think about. And that is all I got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks to the patrons and the Nebula subscribers for making it possible for me to keep expanding what I'm doing and shining a light on cities and what makes them unique and interesting. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.